What does it take to push a future king to finally say, enough? For years, people have whispered that Prince William would never fight back, that he would stay silent, that he would absorb the headlines, the accusations, the speculation, all in the name of duty. But today, that illusion shattered, because for the first time, Prince William didn't just respond. He moved, legally, decisively, and in a way that sent shockwaves straight through the media and straight toward Meghan Markle. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let me ask you something. What happens when silence stops protecting you and starts destroying you? That's the question hanging over this story. And it's why this moment matters more than any interview, any documentary, or any headline that came before it. Because this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't emotional. This was calculated. For years, Prince William did what the monarchy has always done best. He waited. He watched. He let public narratives run wild while the palace said nothing. Accusations came and went. Reputations were tested. Family ties frayed in public view. And still, nothing. No lawsuits, no counters, no dramatic denials. Until now. And that's what should make you uneasy. When someone known for restraint finally acts, it's never over something small. It's over something that crossed a line so clearly, so publicly, that ignoring it was no longer an option. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable. Sources say this wasn't about bruised egos or hurt feelings. This wasn't about tabloid gossip. This was about something far more dangerous: credibility, evidence, and consequences that could no longer be contained behind palace gates. Think about it. Why now? Why would William risk reigniting controversy when public opinion was already shifting? Why step into a legal battlefield when history shows the royal family avoids courts at all costs? Unless the damage had already been done, unless the narrative had reached a point where silence was no longer dignified, it was negligent. And then came the word no one expected to hear in the same sentence as Meghan Markle. Arrested. At first, it sounded impossible, unreal, like another internet rumor destined to collapse under scrutiny. But as reports began stacking up, something strange happened. The denials didn't come. The usual crisis control statements were missing. And behind the scenes, lawyers weren't spinning stories. They were preparing filings. That's when people inside royal circles began whispering the same thing. This isn't about public opinion anymore. This is about the law. Ask yourself this: what kind of information forces a future king to abandon decades of royal tradition? What kind of documentation turns a private family rift into a legal confrontation with global implications? Because here's the truth most people aren't ready to hear. Prince William didn't wake up one morning and decide to fight back. Something surfaced. Something concrete. Something that couldn't be explained away with interviews or sympathetic narratives. And once that door opened, it couldn't be closed again. The monarchy isn't built to react quickly. It's built to endure. So when it moves fast, when legal wheels suddenly start turning, it means the clock has already run out. But what exactly pushed Prince William over that edge? And what role did Meghan Markle's own actions play in triggering what came next? Because according to those closest to the situation, the arrest wasn't the beginning of the story. It was the consequence. And what led up to it is far more explosive than anyone realized. There's a reason Prince William stayed quiet for so long. And it wasn't because he didn't care. It was because he understood something most people don't. Once a royal responds publicly, the story never ends. Silence, for the monarchy, isn't weakness. It's armor. And William wore that armor for years while accusations flew, narratives hardened, and public sympathy swung wildly back and forth. So when that silence broke, it wasn't accidental. It was a last resort. People who've watched William closely say the shift didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, quietly, through clenched teeth and closed doors. Every time another claim made headlines, every time another implication landed without evidence. Every time private family matters were pulled into the public square and reframed as something darker. And still he waited. Ask yourself this: how many people do you know who could tolerate that level of pressure without responding? William did, because he believed time would correct the record, that facts would outlast noise, that dignity would eventually win. But here's the contradiction no one talks about. At some point, silence stops looking dignified and starts looking like consent. According to insiders, that realization hit hard. Behind palace walls, concerns began to pile up. Not about gossip, but about long-term damage. Damage to the institution, damage to public trust, and damage to the next generation, who would inherit not just a crown but a narrative already written for them. That's when things changed. What reportedly alarmed William wasn't just what was being said, it was how it was being said. Statements framed as truth, stories repeated until they hardened into fact. Claims that, once amplified globally, couldn't simply be walked back. And then came the moment insiders describe as the breaking point. Something crossed from opinion into allegation, from storytelling into something far more serious, something that, if left unanswered, wouldn't just tarnish reputations. It could permanently alter how history remembers this family. Think about that for a second. This wasn't about personal offense. This was about legacy. That's when legal counsel entered the room. Quietly at first. No announcements. No leaks. Just questions, evidence requests, timelines, patterns. And the answers weren't reassuring. Sources say William didn't want confrontation. He wanted clarity. He wanted the truth documented, privately if possible. But the deeper the review went, the clearer it became. This wasn't something a polite statement could fix. Here's the part that surprises people. Prince William didn't move out of anger. He moved out of responsibility. Responsibility to his children. Responsibility to the crown he's preparing to inherit. Responsibility to draw a line that said, this stops here. Ask yourself, if this were just noise, why involve lawyers at all? Why risk reopening wounds unless the alternative was worse? And that's the question that haunted the palace. What happens if you do nothing? According to those close to the situation, doing nothing was no longer neutral. It was dangerous. Because once claims reach a certain scale, they don't just harm individuals, they reshape institutions. And William understood that better than anyone. So when he finally authorized legal action, it wasn't dramatic. It was methodical, cold, prepared. No interviews, no emotional speeches, just paperwork. And that should tell you everything. Because when someone like Prince William stops playing defense and starts documenting facts, it means the situation has already escalated beyond repair. But the most unsettling part? This legal move wasn't made in isolation. As the filings progressed, something else began to surface, something that shifted this from a private legal dispute into a public crisis. And according to multiple sources, once authorities became aware of what was uncovered, the situation spiraled fast, much faster than anyone expected. The word spread fast, too fast to control. Arrested. At first, people dismissed it as clickbait, another overheated headline in a media ecosystem addicted to outrage. After all, this is Meghan Markle, former actress. Duchess, a global figure whose every move is scrutinized. Surely, if something that serious had happened, we'd know immediately, right? But then, something strange happened. The usual denials didn't arrive. No carefully worded statement, no sources close to clarification. No aggressive pushback from legal representatives, warning of defamation. Just silence. And in a story like this, silence is never empty. It's heavy. Here's what made insiders uneasy. Around the same time Prince William's legal action quietly advanced, reports began to circulate about authorities reviewing material connected to the dispute. Not rumors, not gossip. Material, documents, records, things that don't care about public narratives or sympathetic framing. Ask yourself this. Why would law enforcement even be in the room if nothing was there? According to people familiar with the sequence of events, what began as a civil legal review didn't stay there. Because once certain information was flagged, protocol took over. At that point, it no longer mattered who you were, how famous you were, or how carefully your image had been curated. Process replaced perception. That's when the story shifted from royal legal drama to something far more serious. Behind the scenes, timelines were reconstructed. Statements were compared against records. Discrepancies, small at first, began to appear, and those discrepancies raised uncomfortable questions. Not about intention, about accuracy. Think about how dangerous that is. Because when a public figure's credibility is questioned in a legal context, everything they've said before suddenly comes back under the microscope. Every interview, every claim, every carefully chosen word. Sources say this is where the situation accelerated. Once investigators became involved, the pace changed. Decisions were made quickly, quietly, and without regard for public reaction. Because at that stage, controlling the narrative is no longer the priority. Establishing facts is. This is the part that shocked even seasoned royal watchers. The arrest, according to reports, wasn't theatrical. No flashing lights, no dramatic scenes, just procedure. The kind that happens when authorities believe something must be addressed immediately before it grows bigger. And that's what sent tremors through the palace. Because arrests don't happen over misunderstandings. They happen when there's concern about evidence, about risk, or about compliance. So ask yourself, if this was all exaggerated, why did it get this far? Why weren't lawyers able to shut it down early? Why didn't influencer status make it disappear? The answer, insiders suggest, is deeply unsettling. By the time the word arrest entered the conversation, the situation was no longer about public opinion. It was about whether certain lines had been crossed in ways that couldn't be undone with apologies or clarifications. And here's where the emotional fallout hit hardest. Prince Harry caught between loyalty and reality. Royal aides scrambling to contain something that couldn't be contained, and a global audience suddenly realizing this wasn't another media cycle, it was a legal reckoning. But perhaps the most ironic twist of all? For years, the narrative had been about truth, about finally telling one side of the story. Now, that same narrative was being tested, not by journalists, but by investigators. And according to those watching closely, the arrest wasn't the climax of this saga. It was the signal that something much larger had been set in motion. Because as officials reviewed what had surfaced, they uncovered details that raised even more troubling questions. Questions that reached far beyond a single dispute or a single individual. And when those details began circulating quietly among legal teams and palace officials alike, one thing became painfully clear. The fallout from this was only just beginning. So here we are. At the moment, no one thought would ever arrive. Not because people didn't expect drama, but because they never expected consequences. For years, this entire saga lived in the realm of narratives, competing versions of events, carefully curated stories, interviews framed as truth, silence framed as guilt, and public opinion treated as the final verdict. But that era just ended. Because the moment lawyers, filings, and authorities entered the picture, the story stopped being about who told it better and started being about what could be proven. That's the part that makes this so unsettling. This wasn't a shouting match. This wasn't a PR war. This was a collision between image and record. And when those two collide, image almost always loses. Think back to the opening question of this video. What does it take to push a future king to finally act? Now you know the answer. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even personal. It was inevitability. At some point, every story reaches a fork in the road. One path leads to silence, denial, and narrative management. The other leads to documentation, timelines, and accountability. Prince William chose the second path, not because it was easier, but because the first had run out of road. And here's the uncomfortable truth many people are struggling with. Once the legal process begins, nobody controls the outcome. Not royalty, not celebrities, not public sympathy. Courts don't care about brand narratives, investigators don't care about optics, and evidence doesn't care who you are. That's why this moment feels different. It's not loud, it's final. The arrest wasn't just a headline. It was a signal, a sign that the story crossed a threshold from which there is no clean exit. From here on out, every step carries weight. Every decision compounds the fallout. And the ripple effects are already visible. Family ties strained beyond repair. Trust eroded in real time. And a monarchy forced to confront something it avoids at all costs. Internal conflict exposed to external judgment. Ask yourself this. What happens when the very tools once used to control the narrative no longer work? What happens when interviews are replaced by affidavits? When sympathetic audiences are replaced by neutral investigators? That's the reckoning unfolding now. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this. For years, the story centered on being believed, on telling one's truth, on finally being heard. But in the end, truth isn't decided by volume or emotion. It's decided by consistency, by records, by timelines, by what holds up when stories are stripped of framing and placed under scrutiny. This isn't the end of the saga. Far from it. More disclosures are coming. More details will surface. And with each new revelation, the stakes grow higher, not just for the individuals involved, but for the institution watching this unfold. Because once legal doors open, they don't close quietly. So now I want to hear from you. Did Prince William wait too long? Or was this the only moment he could act without making things worse? Was silence a strategy or a mistake? And do you believe this legal reckoning will finally bring clarity or deepen the divide even further? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.